Um, yeah, well, thank you for having me. I've been a long time creeper of the group, so I'm happy to present in it and to tell you a bit about our project in Northern Greenland. Um, this is a project that we started a couple of years ago. It's jointly funded by the US National Science Foundation and the UK Natural Environmental Research Council, with cooperation with the Greenland National Museum. So it's a big team doing a lot of different things. From the US, we've got Ray Bradley, who's working on the paleoclimate part, Billy Dandria and Red Stein, who are working on the alkanones, Nick Belasio from William and Mary, working on sedimentology, Alan Condren from Woods Hole, working on modeling, Toby Schneider from Bern, working on the alkanones and hyperspectral imaging, Francois Lapointe from UMass, working on the varves, me from the UK, working on the diatoms, and then from the Greenland National Museum, Fuye Larsen and Christian Koch Madsen, who are archaeologists, and from Norway, Jostein Bakke, working on the sediments, and Inger Alsos, working on the sediment DNA. So it's a big project. The work that I'm presenting is going to be quite diatom heavy because that's my specialty, but everything here has been huge contributions from everyone else. So the Greenland, this is a little bit about the Greenland prehistory. This is an illustration from Nuka Godfredson's books, which are fascinating, kind of collaboration between a graphic illustrator and the Danish National Museum, showing, sort of imagining how people lived in the past of Greenland. So the people that we're going to talk today about are really the Independence One culture. There were sort of two main waves of population of Greenland. The first around 5,000 years ago with so-called Paleo-Inuit or ancient people who came across from the sort of Alaska, Beringia area across the Canadian Arctic. And when they got to Greenland, they split in sort of two directions. One to the north, this Independence One culture, and one to along the west coast, which is the Saka culture, of which there's a lot more known about. Following that, there was another population of northern Greenland by the Greenlandic Dorset people. And then more recently, the ancestors of modern Inuit came across the Canadian Arctic into Greenland, the Thule people, around 700, 800 years ago, and sort of migrated through this region of northern Greenland. So this is a bit what we imagine the population of northern Greenland to look like. People came across Nares Strait from Ellesmere Island and would have been following muskox, more terrestrial resources. They lived in tents, and so you can see there's at the bottom left a sketch of one of these tents. You can see the tent ring with the stones around the outside and this mid passage, which is shown better in the photo. You can see these sort of linear flat rocks form this mid passage of the tent that people lived in. Today it looks more like this, the landscape. So you can see there's this Northwater Polynya, which is on the left side of the screen or the west side, and then this northeastern Polynya off of northeast Greenland. And those are the two main marine productivity areas in around northern Greenland. And then in between that is where people would have traveled. So the area that we're interested in is this area called Wandeldal, which is kind of a bridge between West and East Greenland in the north, in quote unquote Peary Land. And it's this really interesting valley, big broad valley with this lake chain, the upper and lower Midsummer Lakes, which is sort of where we've been focusing our efforts. And the reason why we've been focusing our efforts here is because it's really rich in archaeological sites. There's lots of mostly Independence One culture sites along the lake, kind of traversing west to the east into Independence Fjord. And this is kind of, in the book, it was written that Wandeldal, this valley, and Jørgen Brunland Fjord, the fjord to the east, are to Peary Land what the Nile Valley and Delta are to Egypt. So really this kind of ancient cradle of civilization in northern Greenland. And these are really the northernmost people who've ever lived on the planet. So it's a really interesting kind of region to work in, and an interesting question of how and why they lived there. So in this region, we have three main sort of periods of occupation. The first is this Independence One culture between 4.5 or so and 3.8 thousand years. They're part of the Arctic small tool tradition, so they have these tiny little tools, as you can see in the bottom left picture. They're definitely the most extensive of the sites in this part of northern Greenland. And they subsisted principally on muskoxen, so they used them for food and shelter and clothing and probably heat as well. And they also used other things in the landscape like hares, fox, and char. The Greenlandic Dorset were also in this region between 2.9 and 2.2 thousand years ago, but the evidence for them is much less than the Independence One culture. And then finally, there's some Thule campsites in this region starting around 600 or so years ago. This is what the region looks like. It's not a tropical oasis. It's northern Greenland, so it gets about 6 months of complete winter darkness. The mean annual temperature is -15. It's -29 in January, +4 in July, and it's just hovering on the edge of being an Arctic desert. This is a site from Jørgen Brundtland's fjord. Actually, it's from Cape Harold Moltke. You can see it's set up on an old marine terrace, and there's not much vegetation. And so these archaeological sites are really just sitting on the landscape in this kind of bleak surroundings. So the guy who did most of the archaeological work in this region was a Danish count by the name of Eichel Knuth, who spent his summers up here documenting the archaeological sites along Wandeldal and Independence Fjord. And so he really described a lot of what we know about the sites and how they probably lived. And so we're sort of working off of that work. This is what it looks like today. This is a picture of Toby's from the plane. And so you can see it's a giant valley, very little vegetation, and these giant lakes in the valley. So what we're really interested in figuring out is what the climate and environmental conditions were like that enabled people to live here, that enabled them to thrive here, and then why they left. So kind of why they came, how they stayed, and why they left. So when we look at the broader Greenland climate, for clues, it doesn't really give us much. This is a plot from Yarrow Axford's paper in 2021, which is a summary of sort of Greenland climate history. And you can see that most of the records, the ice core records at any rate, agree that you have this warm period sort of between 10 and 8,000 years ago, and then you have this more or less steady cooling up until sort of the last century. And I put in here some bars marking Independence One, Greenlandic Dorset, and Thule culture in Wandeldal. And you can't really see a great reason, climate reason at any rate, why they would have been there. So for us, the interesting question is, how are these larger scale climate trends actually registered on the ground at Wandeldal? Ice core records give us a very good hemispheric kind of signature of climate, but they don't necessarily tell us what it was like, at sea level, on the coast, in this landscape. So we're interested in kind of what the climate, long-term climate was like, but also whether or not there are any sort of ecological or physical tipping points that would have led to the arrival or the abandonment of this region. Another reason why this region is really interesting is because it's sort of considered the last ice area. Most of northern Greenland and northern Ellesmere Island is kind of choked with ice, multi-year ice, in at least our current time period. And so it's been called this last ice area. But as you can see in the satellite photo from August of 2018, all of the multi-year ice blew off the north coast of Greenland, making it no longer really a last ice area. If you look at the plot on the right, this is the meteorological data from Station Nord, which is in, it's about 70 kilometers from our field site in northeast Greenland. And you can see that over this instrumental period from 1960 to the present, you have this huge increase in temperature, which is at the bottom in red, and precipitation in blue, and that they kind of march in lockstep. So the precipitation has increased so much that it's no longer considered a polar desert, and the temperature has gone up something like 3 degrees in the last 40 years. At the bottom is a plot from Conadal showing the loss of peripheral glaciers and ice caps on northern Greenland. And you can see in the last decade or so that there's been this major change in melt, where you're losing, around a meter a year of surface melt on these ice caps. So our project has 3 main components. The first is archaeology, which is being done by the Greenland National Museum. And so they've been doing drone surveys of the existing sites known from Eigil Knuth's work, also looking for new sites. We've got new radiocarbon dates on existing material that was at the museum, but also new material that we found last year. All with the idea that there would be this baseline so that this area could be designated a new heritage site for northern Greenland. The second component is paleolimnology. That's the part that I'm more involved in. So we've collected cores from a number of lakes in the region. We're dating them. We're looking at the sedimentology. We're looking at the paleoecology, so the diatoms, the pollen, and the sedimentary ancient DNA. We've got paleothermometry, and maybe a little bit in the future, some paleohydrology. The third component is modeling. So working with Alan Condren at Woods Hole to understand how ocean circulation might have changed in the past, leading to the opening or closing of these polynyas and ice bridges over multi-millennial timescales. So we can understand a little bit more of the physical constraints on the migration of people over this time period. So this is fieldwork in 2022. We had a crew of, I think it was 9 of us. Ray and Francois from UMass, Art from the Norwegian Water Institute, Billy from Lamont, Jostein from Bergen, Inutoqqat from the National Museum, Fuya and Hans from the National Museum, and me from Bass. This is what our camp looked like. You can see the coring rigs all at the shore there, and our tents. But you can also see that there's these little tiny patches of vegetation. Otherwise, it's pretty much just cobbles and gravel. But these little old ancient riverbeds are the only place where you have vegetation. This is a view from the west of our site to the west. So looking from lower Midsummer Lake, which is that sort of bright blue with silt in it, further down to upper Midsummer Lake, which is clearer, and looking out sort of to the west. So that would have been the kind of migration pathway of people from west to east. And then this is looking towards the east. Our campsite is in that little horseshoe bay there. That's also where the archaeological site is. And then there's a view out to the east towards Jørgen Brundtland's Fjord and Independence Fjord. So this is a bit what the archaeology looks like. These are these mid passages and a tent ring, which is hard to see in this photo, but you can see in the mid passage, there are these stones in the center that look like kind of baked potato sized. And these would have been boiling stones. So they would have heated them up in the fire and then put them in a skin bag to boil water. And they're just sitting here on the landscape relatively untouched. We found new sites and new artifacts. Looking around at the main Independence 1 sites on the shore there. And also some interesting finds. This is a little sort of 4,500-year-old dollhouse outside of a tent circle. And there were a couple of these, which the archaeologists said looked like dollhouses, ancient ones. From those new sites, we have new dates. So you can see this is the probability curves for all of the dates that we have from these new archaeological sites. And you can see there's a really nice tight cluster between sort of 3.9 and 4.4 or so thousand years ago. And that is all of the Independence One culture sites. There's also one little cluster there around 800 years ago, and that is the Thule site that's to the east of the lake. We were also coring. This is what the coring rig looked like. That's Jostein. So we took cores from all of these places that you see these orange arrows. So each of these main basins of Lower Midsummer Lake. The archaeological site is marked by a yellow arrow. And then we also took a core from what we call Late Summer Lake, which is this little lake perched up above Midsummer Lake. So from Lower Midsummer Lake, we had four more main basins that we cored. Each of the basins was around 45 meters deep. From those basins, we got about 5 meters of core from each of them. You can see the core here that Billy is holding. You can see that they're laminated. They're mostly mineral, and there's gray glacial mud at the base. This is what some of the data from Nedra Midsummersa, the Lower Midsummer Lake, looks like. You can see that there's this decline in calcium. So age along the bottom, 8,000 years to the present on the left. Calcium declines through the record sort of to around baseline state around 4,000 years ago, but most markedly in the first sort of 2,000 years of the record. And you can see that the dry bulk density does more or less the same. This is what the diatoms look like from Nedra Midsummersa, Lower Midsummer Lake. There are no diatoms in the lake at all, actually, until around 6,500 years ago. And then you get these diatoms, Storosarella pinnata and Storocyra construens, which are associated with pretty big deep ice-covered lakes in the Arctic. So this is kind of a typical Arctic lake stratigraphy where you have pronounced ice cover basically through the whole record until around 20 or 30 or so years ago, where you have all of a sudden this real increase in other benthic taxa and then planktonic diatoms in the last 20 years or so. So if you look at the blue plot, the little circles, the hills into species diversity, you can see that there's basically no diatoms, and then there's a few diatoms over the last 6,500 years. And then in the last 20 years, all of a sudden you have this large increase. The PCA axes basically show the same thing, slight increases in diversity with the PC1 axis, and then PC2 really just shows this major lake change in the last 20 or 30 years. This is what Late Summer Lake looks like. The interesting thing about the lake here is that you can see that there's actually quite a lot of vegetation on the west side of the lake. So that sloping shoreline is well vegetated. It's also well visited. So there's lots of goose feathers and poo and various things. So it looks like anybody who lives here goes here. So it seemed like a good place to do some DNA work. Also a very small lake, so probably a little bit more sensitive than the big midsummer lakes for things like algae and other aquatic organisms. So the lake is 9 meters deep. We have a 3 3/4 meter core. This is what the core looks like. It's pretty organic. It's kind of faintly laminated, and it's full of moss. This is what the age depth model looks like. So it goes back around 7,500 years. And on the right is this calcium titanium curve. And you can see that there's also this big peak in calcium in the core until around 5,500 years ago when it kind of stabilizes. On the bottom is a picture of the core, and you can see that sort of the rough parts are where you have quite a lot of moss in the core. This is what the diatoms look like. This is on the left is this blue one is Storosire construens, which also occurred in the other lake. It's associated with kind of post-glacial deep ice cover lakes in the Arctic and post-glacial lakes in other places. And the real change in the core actually occurs in the mid-Holocene. So you have this real change in diversity with an increase in acanthidium species. And so sort of more benthic diatoms, but a different kind of benthic diatoms, not the ones that sort of thrive under poor light conditions. So it looks like a change in diversity might mean a decrease in ice cover in this period between 5,500 and sort of 3,500 years ago. And I've put in here, this gray bar shows basically when Independence 1 culture was in the area. And you can see that it aligns pretty well with this kind of peak, a second peak in species diversity. So these are all of the sites, the different sites together. So, you know, because we've got two lakes next to each other, we have a nice opportunity to look for kind of overarching climate patterns. And seeing the differences between the lakes might tell us something, but also the similarities between the lakes might tell us something as well. So here I plotted together both upper Midsummer Lake or lower Midsummer Lake, sorry, NMS, and LSS is late summer lake. So the small lake is the red one, the big lake is the blue one. And at the top is calcium. In the middle is diatom diversity between the two lakes. And then at the bottom is the alkanone temperature reconstruction. So the temperatures are not on a temperature scale, they're just on the alkanone scale. So it's really more of relative change at this point. And I'm not sure if we're getting a full calibration, but I think we probably are. But it gives you a lot of information anyway. So the first thing that and at the bottom is the probability curve for the Independence 1 culture at our site on the lake. So the first thing that you notice, or that I notice, is that you have this consistent sort of calcium decline across both of these records in the early Holocene. Because it's calcium and the catchments are pretty dominated by carbonates, it makes sense that this would be sort of a glacial outwash or a glaciofluvial signal. And so you've basically got a waning influence of glaciers over this period to the point where they're not really noticeable starting around 5,500 years ago. The diatom diversity is hugely impacted by this silt that's coming into the lakes. So you don't really get diatoms thriving in these turbid conditions that are caused by this glaciofluvial outwash. So you've got declining outwash, you've got very low diatom diversity in this early period, and you've got low lake water temperatures, which are probably also influenced by meltwater at some level. And then starting around 5,500 years ago, you have this peak in diatom diversity in late Summer Lake. Midsummer Lake doesn't really show it. And then both of the lakes show temperature peaks in this period in the early mid-Holocene. And so you can see this peak temperatures, or just after the peak temperatures, both in the diatom diversity and the alkanone temperature, you have, this is when you have people. So the timing of occupation sort of corresponds to this immediately sort of post-warmth period or declining warmth period in the record. So that's the data that we have now. We've got lots of things that are kind of coming down the line in the next months or so. So we've got a more complete alkano and temperature reconstruction coming. We've got pollen, chironomids, sedimentary DNA, more hyperspectral imaging. And then we've got another field season coming in August of this year with hopefully some more longer cores, 8,000 plus year cores, as well as mapping some glacier extents in the catchment and in the region. And then the archaeologists will be doing more mapping, looking for more sites and dating more of the sites in this region. And then further down the line, we'll be comparing these data with other local records, such as this one here, which is the Ribeiro record of the Northwater Polynya productivity over the Holocene. So we have a website, which needs updating, but it's there, it's good. And we also have an Instagram account, so you should follow us and find out what we're doing. And that's all I've got. So happy to answer any questions.